The South China Sea, once a shared artery of global trade, now glows red on every satellite map. Chinese warships patrol from the Spratlys to the Paracels. Artificial islands hum with radar signals, missile batteries, and runways that stretch across the sea. Fishing boats from Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia are turned away. U.S. naval vessels, once symbols of freedom of navigation, now keep their distance. In a single stroke, Beijing has done what the world feared most. It has seized complete control of the South China Sea. Global shipping lanes reroute. Energy prices surge. Southeast Asia trembles. And Washington faces a choice it never wanted: accept China's dominance or fight to stop it. But what would truly happen if China controlled one of the most strategic waterways on Earth? Today, we break down the military, economic, and geopolitical fallout, and what it means for the balance of power in Asia and the world. This video is for educational and analytical purposes only. It does not promote conflict or political agendas. If you want to understand global events beyond the headlines, subscribe and join us for more in-depth geopolitical analysis. Section 1. What does taking control mean? Control, in geopolitics, is never just about geography. When China takes control of the South China Sea, it's not merely about owning reefs or islands. It's about commanding one of the most vital arteries of global trade and military power. Nearly 30% of all world shipping, worth over $3.5 trillion annually, passes through these waters. Every oil tanker, every container ship traveling from the Middle East to East Asia, or from Japan to Europe, threads through this maritime maze. Whoever controls it doesn't just control trade routes, they control global economic lifelines. For years, Beijing's ambitions have been clear. Through its 9-dash line, China claims nearly the entire sea, brushing aside competing claims from Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. Artificial islands have been built, fortified, and armed. Runways stretch across reclaimed reefs. Radar towers rise from the waves. But China's true goal goes far deeper than defense: its dominion through deterrence. By establishing permanent military presence, missile systems, naval bases, surveillance networks, Beijing creates a new reality. Any nation entering the South China Sea now does so on China's terms. Even the U.S. Navy's freedom of navigation operations begin to lose meaning when every movement is tracked, every aircraft shadowed by Chinese fighters, and every destroyer met with warnings from fortified outposts. Economically, the consequences are immense. China could reroute energy flows, impose de facto tariffs through security inspections, or simply pressure nations into compliance by threatening access to their shipping lanes. Overnight, nations dependent on trade, from Japan to Singapore, would find their economies hostage to Chinese control. And politically, the shift would be seismic. The ASEAN bloc, long balancing between Beijing and Washington, might fracture, with some states choosing neutrality and others bending toward China to secure safe passage. In one move, Beijing wouldn't just own islands, it would redraw the map of Asia's power. In short, China's control of the South China Sea means far more than military dominance. It marks the emergence of a new maritime empire, one that could reshape global trade, diplomacy, and security for decades to come. Section 2. How would the U.S. and its allies respond? For the United States, China's total control of the South China Sea would represent more than a regional setback. It would be a strategic earthquake. For over 7 decades, Washington's influence in Asia has relied on one principle: freedom of navigation. The idea that any ship from any nation can move through international waters unchallenged. If China breaks that principle and enforces its own maritime law, it doesn't just win the South China Sea. It shatters the foundation of the U.S.-led world order. Inside the Pentagon, alarm bells would ring. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii would shift into high alert, and the 7th Fleet stationed in Japan would prepare for continuous operations in contested waters. We'd likely see an escalation of freedom of navigation operations, carrier strike groups sailing dangerously close to Chinese-held islands, and reconnaissance flights mapping every new radar and missile battery Beijing installs. But military muscle isn't the only weapon in Washington's arsenal. Economically, the U.S. could rally G7 allies and impose sanctions targeting Chinese naval technology, AI-driven surveillance systems, and key state-owned defense firms. Diplomatically, the Quad Alliance, the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia, would intensify joint exercises, encircling China's maritime sphere with a show of coordinated strength. For Washington, the stakes are existential. Lose control of the South China Sea and you lose credibility, not just in Asia, but globally. Allies like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines would begin to question America's ability to protect them. And when faith in a superpower fades, alliances begin to crumble. The likely U.S. response would be twofold: contain and counterbalance. Contain through economic isolation and intelligence sharing. Counterbalance by arming regional partners with advanced defense systems, long-range anti-ship missiles, submarines, and surveillance drones. But make no mistake, this would not be a quick standoff. It would be the beginning of a new Cold War in Asia, fought not through ideology, but through shipping lanes, sanctions, and military deterrence, where every maneuver carries the risk of turning a tense standoff into open war. Section 3. Impact on Southeast Asia and regional neighbors. When China takes control of the South China Sea, the first to feel the shock are not Washington or Brussels, but Manila, Hanoi, Kuala Lumpur, and Jakarta. For these nations, the South China Sea isn't a distant geopolitical chessboard. It's their lifeline. Every tanker, every fishing fleet, every cargo ship that sustains their economies crosses those same contested waters. Imagine a morning when Chinese Coast Guard vessels begin enforcing new maritime regulations. Vietnamese and Filipino fishermen are told to register with Beijing's Maritime Authority. Malaysian oil rigs suddenly face safety inspections from Chinese patrols. By claiming control, China doesn't just dominate geography, it dictates economic survival. Vietnam, long the fiercest opponent of Chinese expansion, would likely respond with a mix of military resistance and international diplomacy. Hanoi could bolster its defenses along the Spratly Islands, upgrade missile systems, and seek closer ties with the U.S. and India, but would still tread carefully to avoid a full-scale confrontation. The Philippines, under mounting internal pressure, might invoke its mutual defense treaty with the United States, testing whether Washington's promises are real or rhetorical. Meanwhile, smaller nations like Brunei and Indonesia would face impossible choices: comply quietly to protect trade, or defy Beijing and risk retaliation. Economically, China's dominance would turn the South China Sea into a toll gate for global commerce. Control of shipping routes gives Beijing leverage over $3 trillion in annual trade, power that can be used to reward loyalty or punish defiance. Regionally, this creates a chilling new reality. ASEAN unity fractures. National interests diverge. And slowly, the South China Sea transforms from a shared resource into China's economic and military fortress, guarded by missiles, satellites, and maritime militias, a zone where every neighboring country must now ask permission to breathe. Section 4. Global economic consequences. China's full control of the South China Sea would ripple far beyond Asia, shaking the foundations of global trade, energy markets, and supply chains. At the heart of the issue lies geography. Nearly one-third of global maritime trade, worth over $3 trillion annually, passes through these waters. Oil tankers from the Middle East, goods from Southeast Asia, and raw materials from Africa all converge in this maritime corridor. If Beijing commands these routes, it gains not just strategic dominance but economic leverage over the entire global economy. Shipping companies would be forced to comply with new Chinese regulations, possibly paying maritime fees, submitting cargo manifests to Chinese authorities, or even rerouting through longer, costlier passages. Insurance rates for vessels not aligned with China's policies could skyrocket. Global corporations dependent on just-in-time logistics from Apple to Toyota would suddenly find their supply chains under China's watchful eye. Oil markets, too, would feel the pressure. With Beijing in control of sea lanes connecting the Persian Gulf to the Pacific, it could in theory choke off energy supplies to nations it views as rivals, including Japan, South Korea, or even India. That power alone could shift the global balance of energy security overnight. Meanwhile, Western economies, particularly the US and the European Union, would face an inflationary shock. Shipping delays, rerouted trade, and China's pricing influence on raw materials would drive up costs globally from microchips to food commodities. In the long term, the world would see the emergence of two competing trade ecosystems, one centered on Beijing's maritime empire and another scrambling to adapt, led by Washington and its allies. In short, China wouldn't just control a sea, it would control the arteries of globalization itself. Section 5. The U.S. and Allied Response. The moment China asserts complete dominance over the South China Sea, Washington and its allies would be forced to act, but how far they go would define the next era of global power politics. The United States, long the guarantor of freedom of navigation, would almost certainly respond with a surge in military presence. Carrier strike groups would patrol contested waters. Submarines would quietly reposition near Chinese-controlled islands. And Washington would likely invoke collective defense mechanisms through alliances such as AUKUS and the Quad, bringing together Australia, Japan, and India in a coordinated deterrent effort. But this response wouldn't just be military. Expect massive economic retaliation sanctions targeting Chinese state-owned enterprises, tech export bans, and a global campaign to isolate Chinese influence in maritime trade. The U.S. might push for an alternative Indo-Pacific trade corridor, bypassing Chinese-controlled routes altogether. Meanwhile, regional powers like Japan and the Philippines would fortify their positions. Tokyo could revise its defense posture even further, potentially allowing preemptive strikes under new security doctrines. Manila, under increasing pressure, might open more U.S. bases on its soil and call for NATO-style support guarantees. However, there's a dangerous twist. Every move to contain Beijing would fuel its nationalist narrative portraying China as the victim of Western containment. This could rally domestic support behind Xi Jinping, strengthening his resolve and risking a military flashpoint. In the digital realm, expect cyber warfare to intensify attacks on Western logistics networks, satellites, and critical infrastructure designed to disrupt military coordination. Ultimately, the U.S. response would mark the beginning of a prolonged Cold War, 2 inches. The Indo-Pacific one fought through sanctions, naval standoffs, and strategic alliances, with the world's most vital sea lanes caught in the middle. Section 6. The future of the Indo-Pacific order, what happens next? If China successfully takes control of the South China Sea, it wouldn't just redraw maritime borders, it would redraw the world order itself. Every nation that depends on these waters, from Vietnam to Indonesia, from India to Japan, would have to navigate a new geopolitical reality. Trade routes once open to all would now move under the silent permission of Beijing. A single Chinese admiral could determine who trades, who sails, and who stops. The economic ripple effect would be immediate. Oil shipments from the Middle East to East Asia would flow through waters taxed or restricted by China's dominance. Global prices could spike overnight. Shipping insurance rates would soar. Smaller economies in Southeast Asia could find themselves economically dependent on Beijing's approval. But power never shifts without resistance. Across the Indo-Pacific, a new counterbloc would likely form: Japan, India, Australia, and the US, leading what could become a maritime containment coalition. New military bases would rise from Guam to Darwin, while intelligence-sharing networks tightened to monitor every movement of the People's Liberation Army Navy. Meanwhile, Beijing's own challenges would deepen. Maintaining control over vast, contested seas demands immense resources. Regional resentment could simmer. Covert resistance, sabotage, cyber attacks, diplomatic isolation would test China's endurance. And yet, if Beijing holds its ground, it would cement its place as the dominant power of the 21st century, not through conquest alone, but by reshaping the rules of trade, security, and sovereignty. The South China Sea would no longer just be water, it would become the stage upon which the next global order is decided. If China takes control of the South China Sea, the world doesn't just shift, it recalibrates. Maritime law bends to power. Trade routes become tools of influence. And every nation in Asia must decide, align, resist, or adapt. But this future isn't sealed. It depends on the choices made in Washington, Manila, Tokyo, and Beijing on whether diplomacy prevails or deterrence collapses. The United States and its allies must respond with strategy, not emotion or risk, watching the balance of power sink beneath the waves. Will the South China Sea become China's gateway to global dominance, or the fault line of a new Cold War? Only time will tell. If you found this analysis insightful, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to GeoPower Report for more deep geopolitical breakdowns. And don't forget to turn on notifications because in this changing world, what happens next matters.